If there's no objection, we'll begin this meeting. This is a meeting of the Committee of the Whole of the Bloomington City Council for February 24th, 2021. We have one item on the agenda, Ordinance 2106. And for the many people who are here, who may be here for the first time or who are unfamiliar with our processes, I want to explain briefly what this meeting is. As we often do when an issue comes to council that has garnered great public interest, there are many people present or watching who are unfamiliar with how council deliberates over legislation. So that everyone understands how this meeting will proceed, I want to briefly explain some terms. Ordinances by law require that they be put before the council in regular session twice before council may take a final vote on it. For Ordinance 2106, that first reading was last week, just an announcement that the issue was officially on the agenda. At first reading, council referred it to committee to look into the details. We are in committee now, in this case, the so-called Committee of the Whole. Tonight, all of us together as a committee will hear the issue presented and we'll discuss it for the first time, but we're not going to make a final decision tonight. Members may choose to bring amendments to this ordinance, or they may look for more information that is not in evidence tonight. Once again, despite appearances, this is a meeting of a committee. No final decision will be made tonight. No final decision can be made tonight. Only a recommendation based on tonight's discussion. So the soonest that the council could take a final vote on 2106 would be at a second reading in regular session on March 3rd. But it may not be decided next week. The committee may decide by the end of tonight's Committee of the Whole to recommend that it be sent back to council for second reading on the 3rd, or to consider it at a subsequent Committee of the Whole on March 10th, which would make the earliest second reading March 17th. So with that preface, I want everyone to understand what we're doing tonight. I'd also like to recommend that we put limits on everyone. As a committee meeting, we're doing some initial research into the issue. So I'd like to limit questions from council members to 1 minute per person, and then the answer to 3 minutes per response, either from the sponsors or the administration. I'd like to limit public comment to 3 minutes per person. I'd like to limit council member debate comments to 3 minutes, and any rebuttals to 3 minutes per person. Is there anyone who objects to this or would like to make a motion to that effect?
Point of order. Could you clarify what you mean by 1 minute per, is it 1 minute per question? But,
right, in other words, that
multiple questions.
Right. When a council member has the floor to ask questions, that they take no more than 1 minute to ask the question, and there'll be a 3 minute period for them to respond.
Very good.
Councilmember Sandberg.
Yes, I don't have any problem at all with council limiting our time to 1 minute. I think it's good to be concise as we're asking questions. I do, however, object to a 3 minute limit for staff response, because what we're here to do today is to get more additional information. And I think that might be unfair. There might be some questions that will need to be unwrapped that will take longer than 3 minutes. So I want to be, if we could change that, or at least extend it to 4 minutes, I would feel better about that.
Okay. I wouldn't mind making that. I'd rather somebody else made the motion, but I would be fine with that. Any other questions about the idea before we ask for a motion? Is there anyone who would like to make that motion?
I move that staff have 4 minutes in order to respond.
In addition, okay. Well, we haven't made the motion to limit time for everybody. Tell you what, I'll make the motion. I move that we limit councilmember questions to 1 minute, responses from sponsors or staff to 4 minutes, public comment to 3 minutes, council debate to 3 minutes, and council rebuttals to 3 minutes. Can I get a second?
Point of clarification, could you all, just to put that choice or that decision in context, could you comment on what will be coming next week? In other words, will there be other opportunities for public comment and for the sponsors and for staff to discuss this, and what will that look like? That's
a very good question. In context, just so everyone knows, This is the first time that we are going to be discussing this issue as a committee. When the legislation is brought forward to second reading, there will be an entire other round of further presentation, questions and discussion, public comment, and council debate. So this is simply the first go around that we're doing in committee. All we can do tonight is make a recommendation for how to proceed by the end of this evening. Does that satisfy your concern, Councilmember Scambolery?
Thank you, yes.
Okay. Any further questions or comments on the motion to limit time? Seeing none, could I ask the clerk to please call the roll on the motion?
Councilmember Rallo,
Yes.
Bolin,
Yes.
Rosenbarger,
Yes.
Scambolery,
Yes.
Sims, Flaherty,
Yes.
Piedmont Smith,
Yes.
Smith,
Yes.
Sandberg.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's 8-0. I appreciate everyone's cooperation there. Unfortunately, I can't do the timer online. Again, technical problems. So I'll be doing it offline with a device, and I'll simply speak when someone's time is up. With that, we are ready for a presentation of Ordinance 2106. I see Councilmember Rosenbarger, Flaherty, and Piedmont Smith here, and I believe Councilmember Rosenbarger will be the lead presenter this evening. Councilmember Rosenbarger, I'd like to give you 20 minutes for the presentation. Will that be sufficient?
Yes, that's good. Thank you.
Okay. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. I'm going to have Mr. Lucas share his screen for the slides. Thank you. Okay.
Time begins now.
Okay, that's fine. I'm just getting to my notes. 1 second here. Okay, thanks for this opportunity to present and looking forward to the discussion that follows. So over the past several months, there has been renewed attention in our community on people experiencing homelessness who are camping in public spaces. Ideally, every person in our community would have safe and accessible housing. Nobody thinks it's ideal for people to sleep outside, especially in the winter. However, the reality is that some people temporarily lack housing and may be unable to go to emergency shelters. The purpose of this ordinance is to answer the question, when a person experiencing homelessness is unable to go to a shelter, where are they legally allowed to sleep? So the background on this, this ordinance is modeled after a 2016 ordinance that passed with bipartisan support in the Indianapolis City Council. It's worth pointing out that the ordinance to allow people to sleep outside in public spaces was passed 23-2, with all Democrats and 10 Republicans supporting it. As I know you are all aware, this is an incredibly complex issue. That is why 3 council members have come together to draft this ordinance. Co-sponsors are Matt Flaherty, Isabel Piedmont Smith, and myself. However, we are no experts in this field, so we have developed the ordinance while in direct consultation with people with lived experiences, so people experiencing homelessness, the Bloomington Homeless Coalition, the sponsor of the Indianapolis ordinance, city and council staff, and area homelessness service providers. This includes members of the Region 10 Continuum of Care Board. It's also important to note that the Continuum of Care Board considered a draft of the ordinance at a recent board meeting and voted to support the ordinance. A letter of support is expected from them soon, and that will go out in a packet from council. We believe that people with lived experience of homelessness and the professionals working in homelessness services are best suited to inform the issues covered by Ordinance 2106. Okay, so what does this ordinance do? What is the content? First, this ordinance gives the administration the authority to designate a specific area or limited areas on public property where people experiencing homelessness can sleep. A designated area must be 3 things. First, it must be within 1 mile of organizations that provide free meals at least 5 days a week. Second, it must allow adequate space for unsheltered people. And third, it must include access to restrooms. As you can see here, The designated space does not have to be in a public park. It can be on any public property the city chooses. I want to pause for a minute to clear up confusion on this issue, which seems to stem from an email circulated by the administration to many neighborhood groups earlier this week. In this ordinance, the administration has the opportunity to designate an area for people to sleep. If the administration does not choose a location, then people are allowed to sleep in public parks. Many other cities have taken this approach and designated specific areas where people can sleep. So because people are going to sleep somewhere, we really have to find a place for them. If you don't want people sleeping in public parks, urge the administration to designate an area. So once the space is designated, or if people are sleeping in public parks, what happens next? This ordinance sets procedures the city must follow if it displaces unhoused people from a public park or from a designated area. First, the city must follow a uniform approach to providing notice to those affected. This includes a 15 days written notice before clearing a camp or closing a camp. So that notice has to go to people living in the camp, to the city council, and to the Region 10 Continuum of Care Board. The city must also work with the Continuum of Care Board to try to place people living in the camp into transitional housing or permanent housing. Only if all of the people sleeping in the camp are offered such a placement, so there is available housing for everyone, can the city close the camp. If there is insufficient available transitional or permanent housing, the city cannot close the camp unless an emergency exists. An emergency is defined in the ordinance, but I will not go into that right now. If the 15 days notice period expires and the city does not act right away, then an additional 48 hours notice is required. This additional notice is to encourage open communication and to allow service providers and people in the camp to plan instead of being surprised by an unexpected eviction. Lastly, the city must store the belongings of displaced people within reason for 60 days and notify owners for retrieval. The city must also again work with the Continuum of Care Board to connect people with their personal property. Okay, so as the ordinance says, the city may designate an area for people to sleep that's 1 mile from essential services. People have asked, what does that look like? So here is a map that shows circles within a 1 mile radius around organizations offering essential services. So right now, those organizations are Wheeler Mission, Shalom, and Community Kitchen. The next slide, the second map, zooms in so you can see what this area looks like a little closer up. So you can see it goes north to Vernal Pike, over to I-69, and down to Country Club Road. Another question that gets asked is, won't this bring more people to Bloomington? And so to answer this question, I think it's a good idea to look at Indianapolis. As I mentioned before, Indianapolis has had a similar ordinance in effect since February of 2016. To see if allowing people to sleep in public places has increased the unhoused population, we can look at the Indianapolis point-in-time count. So a point-in-time count is a nationwide count of sheltered and unsheltered homeless persons on a single date in January. There's a day count and a night count, and there are a lot of coordinators that participate in this count and do interviews. There are volunteers who help with this, and they go to many different places, including food pantries, emergency rooms, police stations, libraries, and soup kitchens. And so the point-in-time count is currently the most feasible method for gathering important information on homeless individuals and families. So as you can see in this chart, the line is at 2016, and Indianapolis has not experienced an increase in unhoused individuals. This next slide is about decriminalizing homelessness. In 2015, President Obama's Department of Justice filed a brief arguing that making it a crime for people who are homeless to sleep in public places when there is insufficient shelter space in a city unconstitutionally punishes them for being homeless. The statement of interest was filed in federal district court in Idaho in Bell versus City of Boise, a case brought by homeless plaintiffs who were convicted under Boise ordinances that criminalize sleeping or camping in public. So I can read this, I guess. This just says, it should be uncontroversial that punishing conduct that is a universal and unavoidable consequence of being human violates the 8th Amendment. Sleeping is a life-sustaining activity. It must occur at some time in some place. If a person literally has nowhere else to go, then enforcement of the anti-camping ordinance against that person criminalizes her for being homeless. And that's really what is at heart in our ordinance, legalizing a place for someone to sleep if they have nowhere else to go. So with that, we ask again, where can they go? And we want to look at solutions. I think it's safe to say that everyone in this meeting is here tonight because we want to find solutions for unhoused neighbors. Many people in our community are working on short and long-term solutions right now. So what are the long-term solutions that we are working on? I would first say that we recognize the importance of working towards better long-term solutions to homelessness. We do welcome the renewed focus in this community on implementing evidence-based solutions such as housing first models. Specifically, a housing and security group headed by Tina Peterson with the Community Foundation of Bloomington and Monroe County and Efrat Pfefferman from the United Way of Monroe County is leading community efforts to make homelessness rare, brief, and non-repeating. However, this group has not been tasked with the questions raised here, and the group leaders do not think the group is well suited to address them. So with that, we look at short-term solutions. As we all know, people experiencing homelessness are among the most vulnerable members of our city. We need a whole community approach to address all aspects of homelessness, including the tragic situation where someone has no bed to sleep in tonight. Where can someone sleep? There has to be somewhere where people have a right to sleep if they are unhoused and unable or unwilling to go to a shelter. This ordinance ensures there is some place while giving flexibility to the executive branch on implementation. I want to reiterate that the administration has the authority to designate a location for people to sleep. It's reasonable for someone to think there's a better solution, but offering no solution is not acceptable. So we are here tonight to present this idea and to have a really good discussion about it. Thanks so much for listening.
Does that conclude your presentation?
Yes.
We have plenty of time to spare. All right. Well, before we go to questions, I'd like to give the administration an opportunity to respond. Mr. Renaison, are you all ready to present or to respond?
It will be Mary Catherine Carmichael leading off our presenters.
Okay, I'll give the administration 20 minutes to respond. Please go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Well, my name is Mary Catherine Carmichael. I serve as the Director of Public Engagement in the Office of the Mayor, and I thank you for this opportunity to connect with you this evening on proposed ordinance 2126. We just learned of the time limitation. I was going to begin with sharing Mayor Hamilton's response to this ordinance so everyone in this meeting can get a baseline idea of the administration's thoughts on this. I'd love to circle back to that if there's time, but I will say, I'll just go ahead to my other comments for now. I'm sorry we didn't know ahead of time. We could have prepared appropriately for the time limitation. I'll jump down. I apologize. All right. So we'd like to acknowledge that there are strong feelings around this ordinance. There's wide agreement that our shared goal is safe, affordable housing for all who choose to live in Bloomington, and we have broad agreement on many of the steps to achieve that. However, this evening, we'll share our concerns about this particular ordinance and why we don't feel it's in the best interest of the community to pass it. Opposition to this ordinance in no way translates to opposition to those people experiencing homelessness. It's our hope that everyone will be heard respectfully this evening. First to present this evening will be Community and Family Resources Department Director Beverly Callender Anderson, who will share what the city has been doing in the arena of assistance to those experiencing homelessness in partnership with several local social service agencies. Then we'll hear from Parks and Recreation Director Paula McDevitt, who will share information about the impact this ordinance would have on our city parks and Parks Department operations. And then finally, Legal Department Director Philippa Guthrie will provide a direct response to the proposed ordinance as presented. Following those comments, we'll be happy to take your questions, and we understand there's a 4-minute limit to those, so we'll respect that. I thank you and hand it off now to Beverly Callender Anderson.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Beverly Callender Anderson, and I am the Director of the Community and Family Resources Department. In my role, I get a chance to work with several of our partner agencies in the community that serve low and no income individuals and families. And we depend on these experts to provide services to our community's vulnerable residents, to be aware of best practices through their networks and continuing education efforts, and to identify and make the government aware of gaps in services to our most vulnerable residents. This evening, I'd like to share some ways that we have partnered with nonprofit agencies to provide services to individuals and families experiencing homelessness. As COVID-19 grew in this country and the potential impacts became evident in Bloomington, a social service safety net task force was formed to ensure that that Bloomington's safety nets would remain strong for those in need. Directors from the Community Foundation of Bloomington, Monroe County, United Way, Bloomington Hospital Foundation, IU Health, Bloomington Hospital, worked with agencies in the area of childcare, food, shelter, and safety and hygiene. As the immediate impacts of the pandemic were changing and is continuing to change, and families need to adjust, the childcare, food, and shelter groups are continuing to meet and adjust to those changing needs. In this process, FSSA created a grant opportunity for the creation of safe recovery sites for persons experiencing homelessness who might contract COVID or need to quarantine. Beacon, Wheeler Mission, New Hope for Families, and Middle Way House collaborated on a grant which they received to develop a regional safe recovery site. A condition of that grant was to have a governmental agency as the fiscal agent. The city agreed to serve as the fiscal agent for FSSA, for the grant that they received from FSSA for the site, which involves processing the claims for grant funding from FSSA and to Beacon, which is administering the safe recovery site. We also facilitate meetings with partner agencies, the county, the health department, and other organizations involved in this work. Those meetings take place 3 days a week, and through that, we facilitate communication between agencies who partnered in the grants, as well as others involved with working with people experiencing homelessness to assure that they have the support they need to serve clients. These meetings have been invaluable for understanding what was trending in the community and understanding the needs of the various partners and sharing resources. From these meetings, we learn and continue to learn of various challenges and needs and are able to respond. It was in that meeting that we discovered the need or identified the need for a winter shelter for women in the community. It was in that meeting that we were able to talk about the need for the winter low barrier shelter that Beacon ultimately started. We talked about the warming centers and needing to move people who were at high risk of getting COVID from the safe recovery site to a new residential service that New Hope for Families is now administering. And also working with our fire departments to serve as warming centers during inclement weather. And all of those things have come with a cost, and I will let you know what that is a little bit later. Some other funding, and the city has supported each one of those, some of those in conjunction with the county and other agencies and some alone. Other funding that has gone directly to agencies working with people experiencing homelessness includes Jack Hopkins funding, and there were 2 rounds. There was our regular cycle, and then we did a Recover Forward cycle. our downtown outreach grant, which we have done several years, but it has moved from the police department to the community and family resources department this year. And as Councilmember Rosenberger said, recently a housing and security committee was formed, and that's being led by the directors of United Way and the Community Foundation. And they are seeking long-term solutions to housing issues for people who fall into the categories of low, very low, and no income. This committee meets bi-weekly. It also has subcommittees, and that I'm serving with the subcommittees. One is the guiding team, and the other is the Heading Home Review Subcommittee. And along with other governmental agencies, we have pitched in to support funding for an administrative program manager for that group. Also, our downtown resource officers meet twice a week with outreach staff from the agencies working with people experiencing homelessness. It allows them to speak about specific needs of individuals and get those individuals directed to needed services. They can also track people who may not have been seen or heard from for a while or respond to emerging needs. Lastly, there have been a number of programs coordinated by the Parks and Recreation Department that Park Administrator Paula McDevitt will elaborate on a little later. But the support offered by the city in these initiatives and programs and projects that I've named have resulted in financial support upwards of $829,160.50. That's pretty exact. And then there's a lot of staff time that has been devoted to this as well. And I can't talk about the staff time from the police department, but from CFRD, I would say that about 40% of my time has gone to these efforts, plus some of the time of our support staff. So that ends my presentation, and I will now turn it over to Paula McDevitt.
Thank you, and good evening. I'm Paula McDevitt, Director of the City of Bloomington Parks and Recreation Department. And the annual budget memo for every city department begins with answering the fundamental question, why do we exist? And the Parks and Recreation Department answers this statement by saying, the department strives to provide the highest quality parks, recreation services, and green space to enhance the quality of life in our community. Breaking that down, maintaining high quality parks and green spaces is 34 parks, 28 playgrounds, 38 miles of trails, and over 2,300 acres of parkland. We provide recreation services through special events, programs, rentals, special use permits, sporting events throughout our park system. I won't go into the data, but I do have data on participation numbers by event throughout our park system. We can't count our number of park users on a daily basis who visit to walk, to play, to sit, or to be in our parks, but we estimate over 1 million users annually. I share this information because in this discussion, it's important to represent the many ways our parks are used. The Parks Department makes available to everyone in our community access to parks, trails, programs, services, and natural areas, to the whole community, and not just one user group at the exclusivity of others. Anyone is welcome in our parks from 5 a.m. to 11 p.m. The department events, programs, and public spaces and uses by members of our community are limited time uses with a beginning and an end time in particular spaces in each park, thereby making the same spaces open available for others to use when the same spaces are vacated. Allowing camping in any of our parks would take over a space for an extended period of time, of which we don't know how long that would be, and thereby not making these spaces available to others to use, or in other words, monopolizing an area to the exclusion of others being able to use the space. Our operations division works to provide the high quality resource protection, maintenance, ground maintenance, facility maintenance year round at 34 of these parks. A 2018 study revealed that the operations staff base was already stretched to capacity. And this was before we opened Switchyard Park. 3 years later, we continue at the same staffing level with no room to take on additional responsibility that it would take to manage a campground. Allowing anyone to camp in parks would essentially be established a campground, and campground management involves a lot of different best practices that I will be happy to share further in the discussion. The Parks Department does play a role to support the needs of people experiencing homelessness. A successful partnership is with Centerstone Employment Program, which you supported in our annual general fund budget request, and more recently in the Recovered Forward funding. And in 2020, after 4 years, the 2020 program had 35 employees, with 5 of those employees experiencing homelessness. We also partnered with the County Health Department, IU Health Bloomington, and Centerstone to do public health in parks, and I have data on that successful program. And finally, we're an accredited department, and one of the benefits to being an accredited department is that we are able to provide decision makers, stakeholders, and the public that the agency is operating with the best practices of the profession. And I'll yield the rest of my time to Philippa Guthrie.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. Hi, I'm Philippa Guthrie, Corporation Counsel. I appreciate the time to speak with you all. This ordinance carries significant risk of liability to the city because it appears intended to promote long-term housing solutions for people experiencing homelessness, but doesn't actually promote a workable plan for it. And because it will likely have negative repercussions for our community rather than positive effects. I'll start with legal issues. The definitions don't provide a clear authority for the city to declare an emergency in order to close a camp. Under Part 1, the city could only declare an emergency if the situation has reached a degree that would allow that the Monroe County Public Health Department or other public health authority determines a camp as a public hazard. So we would be completely dependent on the county to determine that. Part 2 is broad, and I will talk about that a little later. The ordinance provides a number of opportunities or openings for individuals to sue the city for failing to comply with its own ordinance. The definition of emergency, as I mentioned, is so broad that the city, in Part 2, the city could conceivably be challenged by either individuals who think an emergency declared by the city is invalid, or individuals who think the city should have declared an emergency but did not. Section 30A requires that before displacing individuals in camps, the city must provide written notice. It does allow that conspicuous posting near the camp would suffice, but it also continues after that to say that all reasonable efforts should still be made to provide individualized notice to campers. We don't know what all reasonable efforts means. That's something that somebody could challenge. In 30G, what constitutes adequate space and who determines that? Would the city have to expand a designated area for camping if more campers show up than the allotted space will accommodate? Or can we limit the numbers of campers? The city would also be responsible for complying with any state or county health regulations that might apply to camps that the city permits on its property. At the very least, the state fire code would come into play. It has provisions that require a specific amount of space between structures like tents. And we do know that campers in Seminary Park were occasionally using camp stoves or other devices with flames, which the code would not allow. There may well be other regulations, but we haven't had time to figure that out. There could be things related to public health, disability access, inspections, that kind of thing. Aside from strictly legal issues, there are also practical and policy issues that make this ordinance very difficult to comply with and could create unintended consequences. We have concerns about the Section 30B requirement that once the city issues the notice that a camp will be closed, we would be required to collaborate with Region 10 Continuum of Care Board in order to work with relevant service providers. What does collaborate and work with relevant service providers mean in a practical sense? Who would actually be in charge of coordinating all these activities that would be required? We know that Region 10 Continuum of Care Board doesn't have a staff or funding. It's a network of individuals and organizations that either provide housing or have an interest in housing. for the unsheltered, and they meet monthly. The city doesn't have staff right now that could take on this role. As the sponsors mentioned, as Kate mentioned, the Indianapolis ordinance was a model for this, and there are many similarities, but the issue of who would be in charge of managing this process in our ordinance is different from what the Indianapolis ordinance provided. It is an entity chosen by their continuum of care board and or chosen by the city of Indianapolis. And there is an actual point agency that would be in charge in the Indy ordinance. Sections 30A and B provide the city may close a camp in a public park or on public land after following the notice and collaboration requirements. However, section 30D and then provides that unless the city is closing the camp because of a declared emergency, there must be available transitional or permanent housing. That is a significant statement. There are definitions for transitional and permanent housing. That does mean, for example, that available beds at temporary shelters, such as Beacon and Wheeler Mission, would not count for this analysis. This provision also ignores the reality of how transitional and permanent housing availability and assignment work in Indiana. There is a process for it that is state mandated. In Bloomington, most, if not all, transitional housing, actually all transitional and permanent housing is HUD funded, or most of it. And what we have in Bloomington for transitional is restricted to victims of domestic violence and homeless youth. HUD has moved largely away from funding transitional housing and towards funding permanent housing. So there's very little money available in Indiana for nonprofit social service providers to create any more transitional housing. Permanent housing is incredibly complicated and very expensive to establish. For example, it took Centerstone 3 years to create Kinzer Flats at no small cost. And the permanent housing we do have in our community is almost always full for various reasons. The bottom line is that transitional housing is limited and permanent housing is only sporadically available in basically single units as someone vacates a unit by moving to another community, for example. Even if either type of housing were available for everyone in a camp, it is just not possible to count openings and assign individuals. You have to follow the state process, which involves scoring based on need. So some who are camping would not qualify for permanent housing under the state process. The result, practically speaking, is that any camps created likely could not be closed for the foreseeable future or maybe ever. I mentioned earlier the Indianapolis ordinance. Indianapolis may count temporary shelter beds and emergency shelter beds. Okay.
I'd like to make a motion to a presentation. And
Make the motion. I would
Mr. Chair.
discourage it. Councilmember Sandberg.
Mr. Chair, if I may speak, I will be here all night. I'll be here as long as it takes to hear the public. Make no mistake about that. This is critically important that we hear the foundation from our city staff, who are the professionals that would have to execute this policy if it's adopted. So I think it is critically important that we hear what they had planned to present before they realized they only had 20 minutes. So I definitely second them to extend their time. I don't think they need more than 10 more minutes. We can give them that.
Thank you, Councilmember Sandberg. We have a motion on the table in a second. Is there any other discussion on the motion? Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yeah, I just want to mention that it's normal to have 20 minutes for the petitioner, and so I don't think it's unreasonable that we limit the presentation of the sponsors and the petitioner to 20 minutes.
Thank you, Councilmember Scamboluri.
I would agree that it may not be unreasonable, but I think I would echo Councilmember Sandberg's statement that this is important, and I think it will actually inform much of the public comment that lies ahead tonight. So again, we've already burned up about 5 minutes that we could likely be done by now. But I would support extending it, allowing those comments to get in, particularly since we added the time constraint after the meeting began.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Further comment on the motion? Seeing none, will the clerk please call the roll on the motion to extend presentation time for the administration by 10 minutes?
Councilmember Volden,
No.
Rosenbarger,
Yes.
Scamboluri,
Yes.
Flaherty,
Yes.
Piedmont Smith,
No.
Smith,
Yes.
Sandberg,
Yes.
and Rollo.
Yes.
That motion carries 6-2. Ms. Guthrie, would you please continue? You'll have 10 more minutes.
I will, thank you. I'll try not to take 10 minutes.
Please go ahead.
Section 30G is ambiguous and could be subject to differing interpretations. This is the one that says that we may designate areas and where camps may be allowed as long as they're within 1 mile of social services and prepared meals. I do want to point out in response to Councilor Rosenbarger's presentation that there really is not city property that other than parks that we could envision allowing camping on. I mean, is that City Hall? Is it rights of way? Is it the Trades District, which we're trying to develop? There just really isn't anything realistically besides parks. So this would require us to choose a park or several parks from among all of the city parks. If we don't designate, that means I guess that there could be camping in all parks across the city. If we do designate, they have to be within service areas. Does that mean if the city does designate areas in parks and people start camping outside of those designated areas, are we allowed to enforce the current Parks Board rule, not allowing camping at night in parks? That's a question. The ordinance doesn't address the issue of people who decide they want to camp in our parks who are not actually temporarily or chronically unsheltered. Who will verify whether individuals coming to the camps are actually homeless and monitor that? So if the city designated areas, does that mean that there needs to be fencing around it or some kind of barrier with a single entry point for managing this? It's not really an abstract question because there have been outreach workers identifying people in the past in Seminary Park, for example, who didn't fit the definition of homeless in this ordinance. Even assuming that we did designate areas for camping, prohibiting us from closing camps until transitional or permanent housing and services are provided seems to us to be a blanket invitation to unsheltered individuals from outside the community to come to Bloomington and camp. We are known widely as a very progressive community that cares about its citizens and has many social service providers and broad community support for helping others. So it's a real possibility that our existing shelters and social service providers could be overwhelmed. Finally, we have no idea what the fiscal impact of this would be, and we have almost no way to figure that out right now. In summary, we believe this ordinance is not sufficiently thought through with input from all the necessary parties who should be involved. It's well-intentioned, obviously, but we don't believe it will improve our community's ability to address homelessness or to come up with longer-lasting solutions, and in fact has the potential to make things worse. We urge the council to spend more time refining what the issues to be addressed are and the best ways to go about addressing those. Thank you again, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Guthrie.
Thank you. Councilman, may I finish
Yes.
since we have just a
Please go
few
ahead.
minutes
Yes,
left?
you have 6
Thank
minutes.
you.
Go ahead.
I appreciate the opportunity. I'm sure that this is on this important issue. Our residents want to hear from the mayor, so I'm going to go ahead, since we were granted the extra time, and share his statement on this topic with you, please. I'm reaching out to you today in regard to proposed ordinance 2106, which would, among other things, allow overnight camping in our public parks. I do not believe this legislation is in the best interest of our community, and I've been clear with those city council members bringing this forward that while I believe we share many values and goals, my administration does not support this ordinance. It is my administration's position that sleeping outside, especially during the winter, is simply not safe, and that people experiencing homelessness deserve to be offered a safe, warm location. To that end, we've been working closely with social service providers to help assure there is a safe, adequate emergency shelter for all who will take advantage of it. Allowing individuals to live in our parks in any season, however, is at best a short-term patch with significant negative repercussions for our wider community. It is not the answer for unhoused individuals or the many residents and visitors using our parks for recreation. In partnership with other community organizations, we are working diligently instead on longer-term solutions to the complex issues involved in housing insecurity, which requires time, resources, and the cooperation of other local government entities, social service agencies, and other private entities. We've heard from a number of concerned residents, some of whom support this legislation as the appropriate way to proceed, while others disagree. I share their concerns and believe that all are in agreement that our goal is safe housing for all who choose to call Bloomington home. But we differ on the idea of camping in our public parks as one of the steps on that path to affordable housing, or safe housing, excuse me. What are the key points of concern? Ordinance 2106 would allow camping, including tents, in any city of Bloomington park, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Remember that our Board of Parks Commissioners recently affirmed tent structures only during the hours our parks are open, from 5 a.m. to 11 p.m. The city would not be permitted to close any camp, regardless of when or how it began or who is staying there, unless there is available to all those in the camp. Available beds at emergency homeless shelters, for example, Shalom and Wheeler Mission, would not count for this analysis. The current transitional housing and permanent housing in Monroe County is designated for these purposes, is modest and or largely occupied. Creating more of either type of housing is certainly a goal of this administration, and we've been working as a community to expand it. But doing so is very expensive and typically led by nonprofits who are unlikely to be able to generate significant new capacity without significant new funding sources. The result, practically speaking, could be that any camps created could not be closed for the foreseeable future. The ordinance would permit the city to designate areas in parks and or on other public property where camps are allowed. However, such areas must be within 1 mile of an organization that provides prepared meals to unhoused individuals at least 5 days a week and must provide adequate space for each individual and access to restrooms. In other words, if the city prefers not to limit camping in all parks or on all public property, it must choose certain areas of parks or public property nearest to organizations that provide meals to people experiencing homelessness. This restricts the city's options for designating areas to a limited number of targeted parks and public properties. In addition, there's been no exploration of the city's responsibility to comply with any state or county health regulations that might apply to camps the city actively permits on its property. At the very least, the state fire code contains provisions that would need to be enforced, and there may well be other regulations related to public health, disability access, inspections, et cetera, that could impose significant additional burden on staff and lead to potential financial obligations and or liability for the city. The city would also be obligated to catalog and store 1 96-gallon container of personal belongings per person for at least 60 days should an encampment be closed. This would require an unknown amount of staff time, storage capacity, and expense. And I'll wrap up. In summary, we have not had time to even begin to estimate the fiscal and operational impacts of this plan as presented. Insufficient time has been given to partner social service agencies to adequately address the current conditions and their collective capacity to manage such a regime. Unintended consequences have not been studied. For example, a potential increase in individuals experiencing homelessness coming to the community to take advantage of permitted camping in parks or to be provided with a right to long-term housing and wraparound services. We believe a regional approach to this issue must be explored. Thank you for your consideration. Mayor John Hamilton. And I thank you, Council, for allowing us the additional time to share that what we consider to be kind of an overview of the administration's thoughts on this, as well as presentations from staff members, Calendar Anderson, Philippa Guthrie, and Paula McDevitt. And we yield our time. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, we now are going to begin the question period. Let me just emphasize again, this is our initial foray into the issue. Whatever happens tonight, there's going to be at least another opportunity for everyone to speak to the issue. And it's my personal opinion that this issue is unlikely to be decided even by next week. But I'd like now to entertain questions from members. Let me suggest here that a question with an answer, with a follow-up question and answer should be the process for each member as we go around. So with that, I'll entertain questions from members. Councilmember Rallo, you'll have 1 minute for the question.
Thank you. Well, we heard from the administration that they don't have an idea of what the cost will be, but it seems to be significant and it entails multiple departments of the city. So my question is to the sponsors, what is the cost, your estimate cost to the city to implement this change in policy? It must be significant, but you must have some idea.
Councilmember Rosenberger, would you like to answer or designate someone to answer?
I can answer. So the fiscal impact statement is due, I think, at the second reading or at the next time. So really the number that we have to go on so far is the cost that was incurred, I would say, at seminary. Of course, that is not necessarily all inclusive. That was like $7,000 for the 2 months of people living at seminary. Mostly this ordinance, I mean, if you look at it, I mean, you can look at it a few different ways. Like, there's not a lot of affirmative duties here. Like, yes, things need to be stored in a space. So there is that. And notice has to be given. Other than that, there isn't, I think, extra work. So if anybody else wants to comment on that, feel free.
Councilmember Flaherty.
Yes, I'll just briefly add that following on Councilmember Rosenberger's answer, the primary function of this ordinance is essentially a negative duty. It's not an affirmative duty that creates financial obligations. Rather, it's a duty not to displace people who may not have another option. So I think any financial impact is fairly minimal, depending on how much sort of humanity and dignity we want to grant folks in terms of allowance of restrooms, you know, or other hygienic stations or that sort of thing, trash service, for instance. So there's some sort of not insignificant, but not outsized financial possibilities, depending on what we want to provide in that context. In particular, Section 30G says that one of the conditions necessary for designating a specific area as opposed to a category of spaces would require access to bathrooms. So if that's not already available in a year-round fashion in a public park, for instance, maybe a bathroom would need to be winterized or different restrooms would need to be built depending on the area. So that's something. But yeah, in terms of affirmative duties that you can say clearly this ordinance creates this financial obligation, it's next to nothing. It's a notice to a few people and the storage of items, which we understand to have cost about $7,000, all of that together with staff time over the course of a couple of months. So if the administration has other numbers, I would certainly like to see their assumptions and math, but that's our brief assessment.
Mr. Raleigh, you have any follow-up?
Yeah, well, perhaps somebody from the administration can just reflect on that. They've already stated that they can't, that it's I get the impression it's a large cost involving multiple departments, police, parks and rec, it's public works, et cetera. Is it a significant amount? Just some kind of, reflection on that by the administration.
You'll have 4 minutes to respond.
I can give you an estimate from the Parks Department, and from January to date, it's cost our department $8,500 in costs that include storage of items, staff time spent sorting items, maintenance at both Seminary Park and Switchyard Park. And we estimate, again, the amount of hours that we are spending in maintenance at Seminary alone has increased to approximately 20 hours a week, and equal that at Switchyard Park, just doing maintenance under picking up leftover items and maintenance on surfaces and that. And this is important, as I mentioned in my opening statements, that we are staffed to maintain the services and the facilities that we currently have. These staff hours that I'm referencing means that we are taking that staff time away from other responsibilities. So this is in addition to everything that they're doing. I have a list of what it would take to manage essentially a campground. And that would come with 24/7 supervision. The cost of restrooms to build a brand new restroom in an area that does not currently have a restroom is upwards to $175,000. And there are ratios that you have to maintain depending upon the number of people that are camping in a site, how many restrooms you must provide. So we can absolutely dig deeper, but I can assure you this would be tremendous staff cost, storage cost, contracted services cost for the cleaning and storage of items that are picked up. And we would be happy to provide a more detailed, but it is far and above the costs that have been brought up this evening.
And if I may, we also had over 400 or almost 400 calls for service to Seminary Park in the same time frame mentioned. So there's certainly a cost associated with that.
That was police calls.
Thank you.
I saw Councilmember Sandberg raise her hand next. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I would like to direct this question, I believe, to somebody who maybe can speak to everyone on the staff, and that might be our Deputy Mayor, Mick Reniason, to ask, how much time did you have to spend with the sponsors of this ordinance to go over it and maybe kind of think through some of the unintended consequences that have been presented? Just to give me an overview of do you feel your staff was adequately prepared for what's coming to us this evening?
Thank you, Councilmember Sandberg. I do think we've had a chance to spend, at the invitation of the sponsors or the authors, at least 2 conversations with pretty much the group of people you've heard from tonight, and then another conversation or 2 that I've had with them respectively since then. I think we all feel like, while we were able to share our thoughts and the authors listened carefully and took notes, that the pace of this ordinance is way faster than we're prepared to adequately respond to. And you can hear in some of the questions being asked and assumptions being made on the fiscal side, they're nowhere near what we would estimate. And we can't even wrap our hands around what the true costs are. I know that I've been trying to figure out how much in my past life a public restroom costs to build. I have to at least point out that winterizing or de-winterizing the restroom is more than just turning the water back on. Public restrooms in parks that we do have are concrete block buildings without heating and cooling. So you can't just turn the water back on without the pipes freezing. You have to insulate them and reconstruct them in a way just like your restroom at home that can avoid those freezing temperatures. So it's not that simple. But my recollection is a fairly simple restroom facility is in the $150,000 to $200,000 range to build. It's not cheap, and that's without the year-round use. So again, we have not had ample time to assess the cost, and a reference to the amount of staff time that this was take was, I think, rather summarily dismissed as not that much. I just don't find that to be anything close to what our staff would suggest to you it would take and require to manage a campsite. and have daily responsibility to check anyone who moved into any of the campgrounds for all of the criteria that this ordinance requires. So I would say that we just simply have had not enough time, even though I do appreciate the time we spent with the authors.
Thank you.
Councilmember Sandberg, do you have a follow-up?
Not at this time.
I saw Councilmember Smith next.
I wanted to ask the administration if they believe that the Seminary Square as it was when it was full, did you think that was a public safety issue? And I don't know, Beverly or whoever wants to answer that.
We don't have Chief Decoff on this call tonight. He would be the best one to respond to that. But I will take a stab at it and reiterate that we did have over 400 calls for service from, to the Bloomington Police Department. Of course, there is anecdotal evidence. People have seen a variety of problematic behaviors in that park. So I would consider it to be a public safety concern, but also a public health concern, more importantly, in many ways. And that's really a little out of our sphere. Public health is more the realm of the county. So we had some, the county expressed some concerns about the conditions there. And so we tried to work with them on that. But, certainly when you have people living in these conditions without appropriate accommodations, it becomes problematic very quickly. And I see Beverly is on her screen, as is Philippa, so I'll yield.
I just wanted to say that Chief Decoff is on the call, and so if he'd like to pipe in, he can do that as well.
Thank you.
Is he enabled?
I
think I'm unmuted now.
Okay, there you go. Go ahead.
So as far as the public safety part of this, we had around 400 calls to Seminary Park last year alone, which is the most we've ever had at that location. Keep in mind that Switchyard Park was closed. We had over 300 calls there. So the police calls surrounding the places where homeless people are camping are significant. Those types of calls usually are disturbance type calls or overdose type calls. So they're not minor calls. They're serious calls where someone could get hurt and require further assistance, medical care, something like that as well.
Thank you. Chief Decoff, can you estimate how much that costs the department to
I would need more time to break down the cost of each call, but I can tell you that to fund our DRO program, which is 5 officers and a social worker, it is $546,000 a year to do that. That doesn't account for the regular officers that might also respond if the DROs are not available. But that's just the cost of funding that unit.
Thank you. And do the officers respond to the drug overdoses as well?
Yes, we do. The ambulance service will not respond to certain locations where there are multiple homeless people staying for their safety. So they require a dual response, and the police department responds along with the ambulance service.
Thank you.
I would like to add in as well, just from our parks maintenance perspective, that we have staff that are in those Seminary Park and Switchyard Park, and oftentimes our staff are approached and are yelled at, are harassed while they're trying to do their job, sometimes the job that they're doing. collecting trash, they turn around and it's just been retrashed again. We do have incident reports that are filed, and staff are trained to call BPD for backup if they are in a situation where it is more that is escalated and more than they are trained to handle. But that is a responsibility that falls on both our park maintenance assigned to these sites as well as our park supervisors.
And that's at 4 minutes. Thank you. Councilmember Scambolari, then Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Okay. And actually, Councilmember Flaherty may have been before me.
This is, if you want to defer, you're welcome to do that.
I'll defer. Go ahead.
Councilmember Flaherty, you'll have a minute to ask.
Something of a point
a
where
response. Yeah.
It was a response if that's appropriate. If not, that's okay. We can move on.
I mean, members are directing their questions to the person to whom they want.
No problem.
If you can just hold that thought. Councilmember Scambolari.
Thank you. I have two questions I'm going to try and fit in here. There are any number of reasons I appreciate having colleagues on council who are lawyers, and now is one of those times. Councilmember Flaherty, you mentioned that there is a negative duty and a positive duty, and that was a helpful way for me to characterize this in my head. But what I'm struck by, as I've read this ordinance a bunch of times, there's a lot of language in there that to me is quite vague. So what exactly does it mean that we are required, our city would be required to collaborate with the Region 10 Continuum of Care? What exactly does that obligate the city to do? What are the city's obligations in ensuring, the language here, that persons are offered services? That feels rather broad, and I'm wondering if it obligates the city to do things that are not within its control. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that kind of language and whether or not that will create obligations for the city.
Mr. Flaherty?
Sure, it's a good question, and thank you. And I know Ms. Guthrie kind of highlighted some of her concerns around language in some contexts. I'll give by way of example the Indianapolis ordinance, which I think uses the word coordinate instead of collaborate. We might have started with the word coordinate and switched to collaborate at the administration's suggestion or based on a note they gave. I think what you're getting at is there's a continuum of very strictly defining exactly what everything means versus having some level of a reasonableness standard that will apply. And that sort of reasonableness standard is certainly very common in the law, though I understand how it also makes one feel uncomfortable. We could have said, for instance, a minimum of 5 communications with the Continuum of Care Board, over a 2-week period to check off these boxes in terms of identifying available transitional and permanent housing options. But I think the more prescriptive and detailed you try to get with some of those things too, the more you're undermining the intent of the ordinance. So it is true that homelessness and homelessness services are complicated issues. And I think inherently, there will be some level of ambiguity and some requirement that a reasonableness standard is applied. And we've tried to do that in the most balanced way possible. We had very detailed feedback in a line-by-line way from the administration. I think a lot of that came from Ms. Guthrie, and we've worked through a lot of their concerns and changed things as a result. Mr. Lucas has also been very instrumental in that, of course. So the word collaborate in particular, I think just suggests some two-way communication. Going on what the Continuum of Care Board is and does, Ms. Guthrie expressed some concern about, that they're not a staffed organization. It's a board made up of different agencies. That's correct, but what they're tasked to collaborate with the administration on here is something they're already doing. It's just the job they're already doing. So we're not creating new duties here. And the Continuum of Care Board itself, of course, has heard and weighed in on this and is okay with that language. So I certainly take the point that there's inevitably ambiguity or some level of uncertainty at times, because we're dealing with uncertainty in the situations that one will encounter. Same could be said for an emergency. We've done our best to be more detailed than our colleagues in Indianapolis were in passing an ordinance that they've actually had on the books for 5 years. So we're doing our best. And finally, I will just note on that front, if either council members or the administration have a particular concern about a word or a definition that they think is either too ambiguous or too prescriptive in some way, we're certainly open to hearing that and changing that. I mentioned we already have changed a lot based on that kind of feedback. So if there are particular words that you think aren't defined well enough or need a different kind of level of clarity, we can certainly entertain amendments for that purpose. And I would encourage folks to bring those.
Councilmember Scanbulleri, do you have a follow-up?
I do. Thank you for that, Councilmember Flaherty. Your memo, and I appreciate all of the thought you put into it, included the statement, we believe that people with lived experiences of homelessness and professionals working in homeless services are best suited to inform the issues covered by Ordinance 2106. I think that's true. And I think, as many people have acknowledged, this is a multidimensional issue. This exists at the intersection of a lot of different issues. And so I know that you have consulted with the Continuum of Care Board and others, but I also know that downtown businesses care deeply about this issue too. The parks care deeply about this issue. Staff who work in downtown businesses do. Can you talk about the degree to which you've had a chance to consult with those groups as well in crafting the legislation?
I could, or Councilmember Rosenberg, I'm happy to defer to her as well.
I can take it. So we have had many meetings with different entities. We met with the Kirkwood Business or the Downtown Business Association. We met with the Chamber. I think it would come at this from a couple of different ways. There are organizations that are up for trying to answer the question, like organizations and entities that are up to answering the question that we're trying to answer, right? If someone doesn't have a home, where are they allowed to sleep? There are other groups that don't think that is the right solution, but don't necessarily have a short-term solution to offer. So we have been in contact with lots of folks. I mean, again, we had a good discussion with the Downtown Business Association about what this looks like, right? And their experiences with People's Park over the years. That was really good. I'm trying to think of who else we've talked to. I mean, we've talked to a lot of service providers. We have not talked to IU. Matt or Isabel, do you want to weigh in more on that?
Just briefly, sure. Yeah, we had a handful of conversations with Aaron Predmore at the Chamber, Talisha Kopic with DBI, the whole Kirkwood Business Association. We've been in touch with the BEDC, but hadn't been able to schedule a meeting. We've had feedback from a lot of those folks. I think a common theme that emerged is concern over homelessness, over issues that are sometimes associated with homelessness generally, and then the sort of assumption in some cases that this ordinance will somehow make those things worse. And I think maybe we have some disagreement about that. We've heard it speculated that this would increase homelessness somehow or cause more homelessness, but I think the data from Indianapolis shows that's not the case. So the short answer is we've actually, at your suggestion, to some extent, Councilmember Scanbulleri, we've really tried to reach out to groups and have as many conversations with representatives of the business community and others as possible. I think one takeaway is that trying to prescribe a particular area or set of areas where we legally allow people to sleep if they don't have other options is perhaps a better approach than the broad category public space that the Indianapolis ordinance used, for instance. So that input and feedback has been valuable. Just a final note, I know those groups and those folks care a lot about our unhoused neighbors too, and I just agree with Councilmember Rosenberg that if they don't think Ordinance 2106 is the answer for how to find place for someone to legally be when they have nowhere else to lay their head at night, I feel like we have a duty to find another answer. And so far, we haven't been able to have an answer like that from any of the sort of business groups who may be opposed. But we continue to welcome that input. And if they have a different answer to propose, we'd like to hear it for sure.
I think next was Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask the staff members here from the administration, and thank you all for spending the evening with us. I wanted to ask this essential question. Where can people experiencing homelessness sleep when no shelter bed is available to them? Where can they legally sleep?
Who would like to answer that question on behalf of the administration? Hello?
Well, I guess I would respond by saying, you know, the city has some core services that we are responsible for, just as the county does, the state does, and the federal government does. At the moment, we partner with agencies who are well situated and manage the challenges of people experiencing homelessness better than we do. We don't have a department or set of staff that do this. Even the DROs that Mike Dekoff mentioned earlier, and our social workers, which we've expanded, and our neighborhood resource specialists, which we are also expanding, their goal is to guide folks that need help to the appropriate agencies that deliver the help. They're the experts, they're the subject matter experts. I guess our response would be, those ought to be the people that tell us where the right places are or help us find them. But I'm not sure it's in the city's core service area to locate a place for people who are experiencing homelessness, for a place to stay. We are working on longer term solutions. As you all know, the mayor one of his platforms is working on affordable and workforce housing. And we feel like that is in our wheelhouse. That is something we are working towards and can do, and have dedicated resources to do that. I'm not sure this is one of those core service areas that we or other cities feel like they need to get into. Now, you'll find examples of places that do that. The question would be, what do they not do? Or are their social service agencies in their community as robust as ours? And I can't answer that. I just know that we are not situated to answer that question, and don't believe it's one of our core service areas to deliver that as one of the services we deliver, a place for people without homes to sleep.
So can I
You have a
ask
follow-up 1 minute? Yeah.
Well, it's the same question. Where can people experiencing homelessness legally sleep when no shelter bed is available to them?
Well, I think that's a community discussion. Not just the city staff is responsible for answering that.
Thank you.
For the first round questions from members who have yet to ask a question. I think it's my turn. Councilmember Flaherty, did you already ask?
I did not.
Okay, go ahead.
I believe so. Sure. I wanted to follow up on the same question that Councilmember Piedmont Smith asked, because I think it's actually at the heart of this whole discussion. And of course, we've had conversations about this with the administration. I appreciate the perspective and view that Deputy Mayor Niassen just shared. So instead of asking the same question, because I mean, the answer is no right now, that we don't have anywhere where people can legally sleep who are unable to go to a shelter at night. But my question more so is, if we want to find an answer to that question, if we want to designate a legal place where people who are unable to go to a shelter are able to spend the night, who should lead that process, and what should be done differently than what we've already done, where again, we feel like we have consulted the subject matter experts as represented through the South Central Housing Network and Bloomington Homeless Coalition and others. So if there's a different approach to answer that question, what does Deputy Mayor Niassen or other city staff feel should be done in terms of consulting experts to develop an answer to that essential question?
Mr. Niassen? Or whoever.
Well, I would offer, and Beverly, you may want to jump in, or others, you know, we are coordinating with those agencies. And again, I would go back to my comment earlier about the speed and haste of this ordinance is making the presumption that the city is ultimately responsible for the answer to the question that you are asking us. And I would argue that that's a community question to be answered. Now, when we had an outdoor winter encampment at Seminary Park, and the winter months got worse and the weather got worse, and we argued that it should be more humane to find an indoor space for people to sleep, those groups came together along with city support to make that happen. So if that's possible to make it happen that way, and we didn't staff supervise or create the space. We just helped fund it, and the mayor convened a group of funders and providers. And I think that initiative kind of helped because there was a more concerted, collaborative effort moving out of those two funding and social service meeting groups that were joining that conversation. So again, you're asking us to solve it, and I don't think it's our role to solve. I think it's a community's role, which responded very well to the winter challenge. So since that's currently not a challenge we face, and I'm glad the weather's warming up for a lot of reasons, I'm not sure why we feel compelled to answer that question now, or that this ordinance needs to move at the pace that it's moving.
Thank you.
And if I could add, I concur with the deputy mayor, but I would also say, as he said, this is a community issue. And so I don't feel it can just be the city. We have townships who are responsible for poor relief, and we have the county. And so if there are going to, and I know that you all talk to the housing network, just the providers, but we never all talk together. And if we're not talking together, well, of course, it makes sense to say, well, it's not going to be my responsibility to do it, let the city do it. Or the city can say, it's not going to be my responsibility to do it, let somebody else do it. And so until the entire community comes together and decides that kind of, and works on a resolution to the issue, it's not going, I don't think it will be workable. I think we just need to let the entire community be involved in this decision-making and not put it on any one entity.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll take a stab at a question or two.
Chair Volan, Ms.
Yeah.
Guthrie still had her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see her.
Sorry.
Ms. Guthrie, please go ahead. You've got a minute.
I just wanted to add that part of the question and part of what concerns me about this ordinance is I can tell that that's what you're worried about, but this ordinance doesn't necessarily address that. It's overbroad in that sense. So the number of individuals who can't sleep in one of the available shelters or housing is a much smaller number than all of the people who would decide they want to camp if we are allowing camping in parks. So if there's a way to figure out a better way to address that issue, I would counsel that would be a better approach.
A brief follow-up, if that's okay, Chair Volan.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, astutely noted, Ms. Guthrie. I think this, and we've mentioned a few times that not only are some folks unable to go to shelter because they have been prohibited or because if a shelter's full, but it's also true that in some cases people are unwilling. That's not uniform across the board, but it is a fact. So when seminary was cleared in December, the majority of those people did not go to shelter. They went elsewhere in the community, which is part of the whole conversation here and kind of our view that it's safer for people to be able to be in a designated area than to be dispersed. So I guess I wonder if there's any, if Ms. Guthrie has any additional perspective or others to add with regard to how to treat the people in that second group I just mentioned, namely folks who are, for very valid reasons, perhaps related to past trauma or mental health, simply unwilling to go to a shelter, and we can't compel them to go. What are your thoughts about how to incorporate them into this conversation, in addition to the folks who are truly unable?
4 minutes, Ms. Guthrie.
Well, I'm sorry, I can't answer that. I'm not an expert in this area. I mean, they may be mentally ill, they may have other issues, I don't know. I mean, to me, they should be the kind of people who would score high on the evaluative scoring vehicle that is used for permanent housing. But then again, permanent housing is in pretty short supply. So you'd really have to ask somebody who deals with that population. I don't know if there's anybody on our city staff who can answer that.
Okay,
I'm sorry, I can't answer that question directly, but to Councilmember Flaherty's point, there are people who refuse to or won't go to shelters for any number of reasons. And I don't know that the city has the expertise to care for the people that the shelters can't care for. And so if they are on city property and at some point under city care or responsibility, then that sort of becomes our responsibility to make sure they're okay, that they're safe, that they have whatever they need. And so I think that that's sort of part of the point that some other folks were making before, is that city staff, as it currently stands, does not have the expertise to deal with that, which is why we partner with the social service agencies who do have the expertise. And whether it's shelters or Centerstone or Meadows, I mean, whoever the agency is, that's our reason for those partnerships, to allow folks with the expertise to give people what they need, so that they have what they need.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to reiterate what Beverly Calendar Anderson is saying. I know staff seems to be struggling to answer this question, and there's a good reason for that. It's because, again, this is not among our skill set. We aren't social service providers per se. We just don't have this. We don't hire people who do this kind of work because this isn't the work where we've been charged with traditionally. So we've done our best considering the departments that we have available to us, and we certainly have. Well, that was a good speech if you would have heard it.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say staff is struggling with this because this just is not something that we have been charged with traditionally. So we don't have this skill set. We don't have a department dedicated to this kind of work. We've done the best we can through our existing departments to be helpful and to partner with organizations that are in fact equipped to do this kind of work and have the properly trained people on their staffs to do it. And we do think that's a great partnership opportunity, but that's really not us. Go ahead, Mike.
I would submit to you also, it was mentioned earlier that several of the people that were in the park had been banned from shelters, and so, for a variety of reasons. And some of them just chose they don't want to stay in the shelter. They want to stay outside. And the problem is the ones who have been banned, they've been banned for violence. And so what that now does is that puts them in the community for us to deal with. And if they're in a campground, it has the potential to lead to further violence. And that's why we have so many calls to the park, is because the violence isn't going away. That needs to be addressed. Those are the toughest people, and the shelters can't deal with them.
That's the time. Thanks, Chief. Further, let's go to the final first round question. All right. I'd like to ask Ms. Carmichael, in the mayor's statement, he used these adjectives to describe shelter. You quoted him as saying he sought safe and adequate shelter. And I don't know whether it's you or others who could answer it, but I'd like to know, can you define adequate? How do you define adequate shelter?
Meeting that person's needs, I would assume that would be my definition of adequate. I'm hesitant to put words in his mouth, but that's certainly how I would define it.
I mean, I understand it's a reasonable, way to think about it, but I mean, I think that adequacy begins. It begins with being able to sleep. Is that, like, if that's adequate for some, like they just need to be able to sleep somewhere. Like I don't understand why that's not a part of it. Does shelter mean it's actually indoors when he's defining safe and adequate shelter, or when the staff is defining it? I wonder what staff thinks of that in general.
I would say that we certainly think that people deserve to be indoors, that we've been pretty clear on that throughout this process.
Okay, but I mean, if certainly we all think that they deserve it, but if we can't provide it, why isn't adequate include the ability to sleep somewhere?
Well, I guess I would say we are working to provide affordable housing. We're working on that. That is part of our charge. And we feel, Mayor Hamilton has spoken about that since he ran for office 6 years ago, talked about it second time around as well, and has done more than any other administration has before him to make that available. So I guess I'm not sure I'm getting where you're headed, Steve. I'm sorry.
That's a sufficient answer for now. Thank you. The other question I'd like to ask is specifically to Ms. McDevitt. She said, she talked about the program where of the 30 employees, 5 of them were experiencing homelessness. Can you talk a little bit more about those employees? How did that happen? What happened to those employees? Are they housed now? Can we have a little bit more detail on that point?
Sure, I can provide detail up to a point, but okay. I think it's important that the way the partnership is formatted, and again, this is a really good example of the parks resources which are in this employment program. We have the facilities, we have the landscaping areas, we have the areas that need to be maintained, and we have the tools and staff that do that and can train. So that's what we bring to the table in that partnership. These employees from Centerstone are actually hired by Centerstone through their employment program. So they are working with the Centerstone staff. They are interviewed and accepted, and there's a lot of support services for them. And then they are matched to the jobs that we have available. So when they come on site, we're training them, and then they get a full work day in, and this goes on for the season. The questions that you're asking really would need a follow-up from Centerstone because they are cases that they manage. So as I said, in just collecting the data, how many employees do they have, and what were their backgrounds, that's as much information as I have, because again, our part of the partnership is very focused on the jobs of park maintenance and landscaping tasks that we bring to that partnership program. But we could happily follow up with that data that you ask.
Thank you. I'd be interested to hear more about that. We'll now go to a second round of questions. Are there more questions from members? Second call for more questions from members. I'm a little surprised. Councilmember Piedmont Smith, you'll have 1 minute.
Thank you. I wanted to ask the city staff who are here, do they have an alternate solution for people who are experiencing homelessness and are unable to go to a shelter for whatever reason? Do they have an alternate proposal, or have they been working on a solution?
I think our response to that, again, has been pretty consistent as far as we don't feel that the full burden of that should just be on the City of Bloomington or City of Bloomington staff, that this is a community. In fact, I'd even go farther than that and say it's a regional issue, and that it needs to be solved in a really collaborative and cooperative way, and not just one organization, one entity, a municipality swooping in and saying, this is how we're going to do this. Again, we don't have the expertise to manage this appropriately. So we rely on our partnerships, absolutely. And so I think that's where the answer to your question is going to lie. It's going to be not only with the City of Bloomington, but it's going to be with Monroe County. It's going to be with United Way. It's going to be with the Community Foundation. It's going to be with Beacon. It's going to be with Centerstone. It's going to be with people interested in building affordable housing. It's going to have to be a coalition, because this, as you know, you guys have looked into this, you're familiar with it. This is a problem that is multifaceted, and to just expect to do a sweeping ordinance in a matter of weeks and say, check this box and say, okay, well, we've solved that. I don't believe it's going to work that way. And so without our partnerships, I don't believe we are positioning ourselves to be able to be successful in this realm.
Let me clarify. I'm sorry, I should have been more specific in my question. So I understand that the city feels like it's not up to them or up to the administration to carry the full burden of this. But and I know that the city has been working with Tina Peterson, Efrat Pfefferman, and that group on longer term solutions. But what has the city done towards shorter term solutions?
Well,
I know that it's not going to happen overnight, and
So I will say, Councilmember Piedmont-Smith, that in my presentation, I outlined what we've done with shorter term solutions. We outlined how we have worked with the agencies that provide shelter. I mean, Paula McDevitt talked about the programs that they've had. And so, things like the women's shelter that we did not have 3 months ago, the women's winter shelter, the emergency shelter that Beacon put up, which was a low barrier shelter, which is now housing 50 people a night or sleeping 50 people a night, along with Friends Place that's sleeping another 49 or 50. We have worked with them to get that going. We are working with the isolation shelter, and that's strictly COVID related, but still, I mean, those are people that did not have any place to go. And so through a lot of the efforts that we have partnered with, we are sleeping.
You're muted, Ms. Callender-Anderson. You went mute. You left out we're sleeping.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is it okay? Yeah. So yes, I was just saying through all of the agencies, whether it's Wheeler or Beacon, the winter shelters, I mean, they're sleeping upwards towards 200 people a night. And so those are the things that we are doing. And when you talk about the short-term solutions, I mean, that's what we are doing in the short term and in the emergency term and for the emergency situations.
Has the city of Bloomington provided funds or staff for the new low barrier Beacon shelter?
We have not provided funds for the low barrier Beacon shelter. We weren't asked to provide funds for the low barrier Beacon shelter, but we did help with support in working, through parks, through our fire department, getting permits, other support that they needed. So it wasn't direct funding, but we have provided direct funding for Shalom, for extending the warming center, for other things that Beacon has needed, as well as Wheeler, as well as Centerstone. I mean, actually just about every one of the agencies that work with people providing homelessness, we have provided some funding for their efforts, whether that's in staffing or supplies or support. And that's where that $800,000 plus comes in.
Thank you.
Further questions? Councilmember Smith, you'll have 1 minute.
I'd like to ask Councilmember Piedmont-Smith a question that's always in my mind. Do you think that the Seminary Square Park was safe?
I can't answer that. I have to admit that I was only there once, so I
have a follow-up question then. I would like to ask Mr. Wason to give us an idea of what was removed from the park by Public Works.
First, I'd like to have a chance to weigh in as
yeah, it's in order for Mr. Flaherty to answer first.
Okay. Do you think the park was safe, Mr. Flaherty?
I think it's possible there were safety issues. What I think I can say is that it was more safe for unhoused neighbors to be able to have a common area to be where service providers knew where to find them, where community advocates knew where to find them and help them. That was more safe than the actions the city took, which dispersed them into unknown locations in the community where service providers did not know where to find them, where people were isolated and lacked communication. That's the answer that you will get from people experiencing homelessness if you ask them, as well as from probably almost any service provider. There's an idea that's sort of being perpetuated repeatedly by the administration that it's unsafe to sleep outside, or seminary was not a safe situation, therefore we should ban it and clear the encampment. but that doesn't actually make the problem go away. It doesn't solve it. Those people didn't go to shelter, generally speaking. So if we're talking about degrees of safety in the full context of the situation, which I think is vitally important, then I would say we could have made that situation safer. Providing bathrooms would have helped. Trash service would have helped. We advocated for those things. But yes, of course, there were probably some safety concerns at times.
Do you think it's safer in camping out in the park or in a shelter?
I think it's safer in a shelter, but that's not a choice you can compel people to make. You can't force people into shelter. Some people, again, will not go or are prohibited.
Well, I
got to
keep
deal with the pragmatic reality.
I keep asking the question to my mind is if the people that are out and don't want to go to shelter, there's reasons there. Perhaps it's substance abuse, perhaps it's mental illness. And instead of this discussion, I wish we would be having a discussion about how do we get people the services that they need so that then we can get them into a warm, dry bed.
Yeah.
And I find that what we're doing now is not that helpful.
I think it's a both and, in my view. I think those are all vital questions as well, Councilmember Smith, that also need to be worked on and are being worked on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember.
I'm sorry, Councilmember Boland, may I say just one thing in response to Councilmember Flaherty? Or no?
That will be up to Councilmember Smith.
Okay, in response to Councilmember Smith. I was just going to say, that we also have to recognize, even when there was the encampment and seminary, not everybody would sleep in the encampment. And so you're always going to have people that will not go to shelter, will not sleep in the encampment. And so that's one of the beauties of the DRO program and working with the outreach workers and the social worker is that they are able to locate people. So I understand that when people left the park, not everybody went to shelters, but everybody wasn't in the park to start with. And so, again, I think getting the services to the people is the most important thing about that. And so right now we have programs for that, but I just wanted to make that point as well, that not everybody was sleeping in the encampment in the park.
Thank you. I'll go to Councilmember Piedmont Smith. You'll have 1 minute.
No, I'm sorry. I wanted to respond to something previously, but that's
all right. Are there further questions from members? I have one if nobody else does. Councilmember Scamboluri, you'll have 1 minute.
Thank you. People are going to be confusing us for a long time, Susan. I guess I come back to a fundamental question. If this ordinance is passed and is a success, how would we know? And if this ordinance is a failure, how would we know? And I realize the answer to that may well lie somewhere in the middle. But I'm wondering, what do the sponsors see as indicators of success and by extension, indicators of failure?
Ms. Rosenbarger, do you want to direct traffic here?
I think we all might want to weigh in on it because I think we all might sort of have our own imagined successes here that probably piggyback off of each other. I will start by saying two things, and I think they're short and long term. First, it is that people who cannot sleep in a shelter have a safe place to sleep. So that is a short-term solution. Right now, they don't have that safe place. Two, I think it would be that people without homes have homes. So that is the long-term solution.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith, then Councilmember Flaherty.
Yeah, I would agree with Councilmember Rosenbarger on that. I think a very good positive outcome in the short term would be that people who are just trying to sleep won't have the fear of being rousted and not and just being rousted and being arrested and having their belongings taken from them. That fear, alleviating that fear, I think would be a very positive outcome in the short term.
Mr. Flaherty.
And what would
follow up? Yeah.
And what would be an indication that this was a failed idea in your minds?
I think,
Mr. Clay, did you have a chance to answer the first question?
I can do both if that's okay. I think in terms of success, well, long-term, we all agree, everyone here knows that long-term solutions and more housing stability and affordable housing and permanent supportive housing and other forms of permanent housing are needed. And everyone is committed to working on those things, I think. It's the short term we are talking about with this. To quote again from the Obama DOJ, sleeping is a life-sustaining activity and must occur at some time in some place. If a person literally has nowhere else to go, then enforcement of an anti-camping ordinance against that person criminalizes her for being homeless. So I think as a threshold matter, if we end that, what the DOJ considers criminalization of homelessness for people who are unable to go to shelter, that is a big short-term success. That is vitally important and at the center of this issue. I think failure would look like no appreciable improvement in our point in time count numbers over time. I think there's a big win off the bat that won't go away as long as this ordinance remains in effect. But I think failure is if we fail collectively as a community, and that is wider. It's service providers, it's government, it's multiple stakeholders, it's funders, it's county, it's trustees. If we fail as a community to find new and meaningful solutions that can appreciably change the situation and obviate the need for this ordinance at all, I think that's the failure if we can't meet that task as a community.
Ms. Camilleri, does that satisfy your question?
Did Ms. Piedmont Smith want to respond to as a sponsor? Maybe not. I just didn't want to overlook.
Mr. Dekoff.
Well, I would just...
Hang on. Ms. Piedmont Smith.
I agree with Councilmember Flaherty. I think that a failure would be if we did not gradually reduce the number of people who are homeless. And that's a failure we've been living with for 30, 40 years. This is not a new problem. So, we've been failing for a long time. I think that this could light a fire under our butts to do more about it.
I see Councilmember Sandberg with a question.
Thank you.
You'll have 1 minute.
Yes, if I could ask Philippa Guthrie to respond to the DOJ position, or anyone else that wants to weigh in on that platform.
I don't know what that DOJ reference is. Was that a case?
Department of Justice issuing, it was stated in the presentation. I don't know if...
Mr. Flaherty perhaps can give us the quote, the citation.
And clarify, it was a DOJ brief in the context of the district level case of the Boise v. Martin. So the Ninth Circuit case sort of that is the most direct guidance I'm aware of from federal circuits on this issue. Granting, of course, we're in the Seventh Circuit, but this was the opinion of the Obama DOJ at the time. So it was a 2015 brief.
Right. No, okay. I know the Boise case, but that involved criminal penalties. So we don't have that here.
And I also add that I can't think of a time where we've ever arrested anybody for sleeping in a public space.
Ms. Sandberg, does that satisfy your question?
Yes, thank you. It's about the criminalization of people.
Understood.
Who are public places. Yes, thank you.
Are there further questions? Councilmember Smith.
I have one more question, and I promise I won't ask another one for a while.
You're allowed.
Okay.
You're allowed.
So when we're talking about folks that don't want to go inside to a shelter, I have looked and seen many conflicting numbers on the number of people. So we see one of the numbers in the ordinance is there's 334 people out there, and then there's 39, and then there's 60. And from my discussions with staff who were down at Seminary Square, there was, after all the folks were offered places to go, there was one person left, maybe, or a couple. And I will be honest, and I don't exactly know then what happened, but it does sound like the numbers that truly don't want to go to a shelter are very low.
Can you get to the question? Sorry, go ahead.
And so I just wonder what the number is. What is the scope of the issue as far as persons that are unhoused that refuse to go to a shelter?
To whom are you addressing the question?
Oh, Ms. Rosenbarger.
Ms. Rosenbarger, please go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Okay, so I'm sorry that your question is, what are you're just confused. You've heard a lot of different numbers and you're wondering like what's the most accurate?
Yeah, how many are we talking about?
Right, so there is the point in time count that was mentioned in the PowerPoint, but I did not say out loud, right? So that was the number of people that are currently experiencing homelessness at a point in time in one day. I know Matt really wants to answer this, so he can as well, I would say. There's also a number of people that the service providers know are sleeping outside, or like, it's impossible to know, but like they have a general idea because they tend to know every person here who is unhoused. I will also let Councilmember Flaherty weigh in on that.
Mr. Flaherty.
I'm sorry, I just had the numbers on my mind, so I was ready to recall them directly. Beacon street outreach workers from Beacon Inc. counted 39 people with a by name survey who were sleeping in Seminary Park at some point in the January time period. Now, publicly, I've never heard the administration dispute those numbers. I did hear them give different numbers over time, reducing as time went on. But of course, at that point, we had the threat of eviction from space. There was notice that you were going to be removed, and people started moving on, some perhaps to shelter and some to other areas in the community, hidden in the woods or whatever else. So we do have a 39-person by name survey from street outreach workers in the homelessness services community. Reverend Gilmore, I believe, is on the call and could perhaps weigh in on that during public comment. There was an estimated additional 20 to 25 sleeping in other areas elsewhere in the community at that time. So 60 plus, most likely sleeping outdoor unsheltered at a point in January. So again, as those numbers reduced over time, you're right. And first of all, additionally, I'll just note that nothing in this ordinance prohibits, and I think it's actually a very good thing that the administration and DROs and others work with people to try to get them to shelter if that's a safer option for them and can encourage that. That's perfectly acceptable and fine. It's more about recognizing that that's not always the path that people are willing to take. So I think as numbers reduced, that's not a very accurate snapshot of what the scope of the problem truly is, or how many people are truly unwilling to go to shelter, because it was done in a sort of state of duress of some kind. So those specific numbers I wanted to bring to the fore.
Mr. Smith? Ms. Piedmont-Smith, do you have a response?
No, I have a question.
Okay, Mr. Smith, does that satisfy your question?
I was going to say Chief Dekoff has a comment.
All right, Mr. Dekoff.
Yeah, so my understanding with the survey that Mr. Gilmore did, they asked people that. We actually had people go at night to the park and count actual people in tents. At the highest point, I believe it was 14, and at the lowest it was 1. And so there were many more tents that were in the park that were left there, but the actual people sleeping in those tents at the seminary were less than the 39 that was revealed in their survey that they did. And that was determined by actually physically counting people at the park.
Thank you.
If I may add, I feel that Councilmember Flaherty's response kind of diminishes the really hard work that social service agencies did every day and every night in that park to help people find shelter or, a safe place to be. So it wasn't just an accident. It was the result of day in and day out hard work from our DROs and social service agencies.
Mr. Flaherty, do you have a response?
I just will note that I said that was good, and we encourage that.
Thank you. Next question was from Councilor Piedmont-Smith, and then Councilmember Rallo. You'll have 1 minute, Councilor Piedmont-Smith.
Thank you. I wanted to ask the administration, the claim was made that we do not criminalize homelessness in Bloomington. But when Seminary Park was cleared of tents in December and again in January, weren't people told that they would be arrested if they did not leave? I mean, isn't that what clearing a camp is? Could somebody please clarify?
Who would like to address this question?
I think I can.
Go ahead.
So no one was arrested. Obviously, we took great steps to find people housing. We had Wheeler Mission was there offering housing. We took some people to the Stride Center. And so there was no one was arrested. We did not have to make the threat to arrest people. We just asked people to leave and told them what the park rules were and that the parks were closing, and people left on their own.
I wanted to say too, because I think that the issue came up really with the Boise case. Their ban, as I understand it, had criminal penalties if you didn't leave. You were either arrested, some of them ended up, I believe, in jail. We don't have any kind of regulation that imposes a criminal penalty like that. So, I mean, my understanding from Chief Dekoff is that if somebody were behaving badly or you know, resisting and violent, it would be the same as any other circumstance where they'd try to deal with that person. But normally we use the DROs and de-escalate and do all of that kind of thing. So.
But you could perhaps understand if people thought they would be arrested. Anyway, sorry, that's a comment.
Did you have a follow-up, or is that
No.
okay? Next, Councilmember Rallo, and then Councilmember Flaherty. Councilmember Rallo, you'll have 1 minute.
Thank you. Chief Dekoff, could I clarify something that you mentioned? And that is, can you hear me? My connection's unstable. I don't know if
we can hear you. You're coming through loud and clear.
Okay, so you were revealing numbers that were really quite different than what Councilmember Flaherty was maintaining, which is that the number of those individuals experiencing homelessness who chose to stay in Seminary Park, it was much smaller than what was claimed. If we're talking about 1 to 14 people, it seems to me that a lot of resources are being spent then to codify opening all parks to 24-hour camping. So my question is to you, I'm just wondering in terms of time, because we know that people were, initially there were a lot of people as social service agencies tried to find them shelter. Did that number diminish? In other words, when did you find the one person and when did you find the 14? Did you find 14 early in the process and then it diminished over time? Is that how it happened? So we're talking about really relatively few people that are staying in Seminary Park.
If we can get to the question.
Go to a shelter. I'm clarifying. And is that correct, Chief?
Yes. When we counted the highest number, that was actually, I believe, before we even took the action to clear the park. The lower numbers were after the park was cleared. There were still a couple of individuals that still tried to stay there, and when we would go there, it, like I said, it was 1 or 2 people, and then finally no one was staying there.
I see. Well, thank you for that clarification.
Councilmember Flaherty. We'll have 1 minute.
I could offer a brief clarification as well, if Mr. Rallo is interested, or I can just move on to my question.
Mr. Rallo?
Does it differ than what I just heard?
I would just note that the points in time were different. The counts the police, DROs, and related agencies came after notice was given to clear, after Bloomington Homeless Coalition was working with folks who were unwilling to go to shelter to get them in other locations, et cetera. So it's a point in time thing to some extent.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Flaherty, you'll have 1 minute.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on the question Councilmember Piedmont Smith asked, which is, when police are telling you you have to leave a space, and you're an unhoused person, you probably don't make the complete distinction, perhaps, as I don't think, and I don't mean that to say anything specific about unhoused people. I think most people would think if the police are telling them to do something, they probably have to do it. So that's correct. There's a parks ordinance that bans camping overnight in parks. But what would happen if an unhoused person simply refused to leave? Would there ever be any penalty at all? And if so, what would that be? We certainly know that sort of people are told they can't be there, and there's a threat, that you must leave in some way, or you will be cleared or forced to leave. I think we're splitting hairs a little bit on criminalization, and maybe it might be true that we don't have something codifying criminal penalties, but I think this qualifies in most descriptions of it. And I guess if I could get the administration to clarify a little bit, what would happen in this eventuality, kind of if people did not leave? I mean, do they have a right to be there or not, basically?
4 minutes, Mr. Dieckhoff.
So the park's closed. There's hours. Technically, it could be considered trespassing, but that is not the approach that we took when we cleared the park. We worked very hard to find places for people to go. As I stated earlier, one of the first night we cleared the park in December, there were people that went to Wheeler Mission. There were people that went, got in their cars and left. And there were people who we took to the Stride Center because they had been banned from shelters. In January, when it was closed, there were fewer people in the park. I think there were 3 or 4 total. And again, there were services that were offered. We made sure we had sheltering availability when we went there, so that if anyone wanted to take advantage of that, we could get them shelter, and we did not have to arrest anyone. And again, this is a population that the DROs and the social worker work with every day. So it's not like they're strangers and that they fear stuff. We worked with them. They had plenty of notice that this was going to happen. But again, it was a collaboration of several service providers that helped try to get shelter for people. We presented them with lots of options, and some people just did not want to sleep in a shelter for whatever reason.
Just a brief follow-up. I thank you for that. And again, I fully support having the city and sheltering agencies work with folks to get them into shelter if that's what they choose to do, and it's done in a sort of not under threat. But you mentioned there that we did not have to arrest anyone, but that to me implies that you might have. So I guess my question is, can the administration and the police department commit to never arresting someone for being in public space if they are unable or unwilling to go to shelter? If they're not breaking any other laws besides trespassing for being in that public space?
I don't know that I can ever commit to not enforcing the law. So I can't answer that question.
So enforcing the law, what law? The parks ordinance or the trespassing?
Trespassing.
Okay. So it is against the law for people to be there, and it might be enforced by the police.
It's possible.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions from members? If not, I'll take one. I wanted to ask about, this is a bit of an aside, but several years ago, the council was faced with the question of our zoning ordinance and all the practical inability for a so-called adult-oriented business to locate within the city limits. That many cities had effectively zoned adult-oriented businesses out of the city, and that was obviated by higher law. We've just heard Mr. Flaherty and Mr. Dieckhoff say that the people could be arrested for trespassing in parks, and that effectively that does sort of criminalize sleep. I wonder if Ms. Guthrie has any thoughts about comparing that to, I mean, can we not create some portion of the city where it would be allowed to sleep, if nothing else. Does that make sense?
Well, I think that's what they're trying to do with this ordinance. But I agree with Chief Dekoff. Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, go ahead. Finish what you were saying.
Well, just that we have an obligation to enforce the law. And if somebody has been asked to leave and is technically trespassing, we should enforce the law.
I would follow up with that lots of people call the police every day for people who are trespassing. The shelters have called the police to enforce trespassing on their property. Service providers have called the police to do that. So that is something that we do every day. What we really should be looking at that I think would also help is finding a way so that shelters don't have to ban people. I mentioned earlier that part of that is the people are being banned for violence. The police department goes through de-escalation training all the time. Perhaps maybe we could share some of that training with shelter providers so that they don't feel the necessity to have to ban people, and the people that are the most problematic would be getting services that they need.
Okay, but I mean, it still sort of is the case that if trespassing is if the park is closed after 11 and it's trespassing to be there after 11, and any place else that a person goes to lie down would be trespassing on private property, there's literally no place for anyone to go. I don't understand how that, I don't know how to, I just ask your response to that.
There's a lot of discretion that police officers use every day. Just because someone may be sleeping on private property behind a building doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to get arrested. And so the parks are a little bit different situation. There are established hours for the parks, and being in a park after hours is technically trespassing, which could be enforced with a misdemeanor arrest.
So what you're saying in essence is that de jure, it's not legal to sleep anywhere outside in the city, but de facto, practically speaking, people do it every night because we don't or can't enforce the law in all cases. Is that a safe way to put it?
That's what you said.
So you wouldn't agree with that?
No, I wouldn't agree or disagree.
Okay, I'll leave it at that. Are there further questions from members?
Point of order, Ms. Carmichael had her hand up to respond.
Thank
to
you.
Oh, sorry, Ms. Yeah, go ahead. I didn't see you.
Yeah, I would just challenge your question to begin with. I think it begins with the assumption that this is hours and hours alone to solve. You're asking staff these questions that you assume are entirely ours to solve. And I had to reiterate that that's not our belief. We believe that we work in a greater environment with more people, more partners, and that we're not going to figure this out by ourselves, and that we shouldn't be expected to have these answers for that question right now. We don't know the right answer for that, but we do want to continue the process that we've begun to find better answers for that.
Well, with all due respect, I understand the extensive response that you've given to the problem overall. I was trying to ask a very narrow question, which seems to have been answered. But regardless of intent or the noble, however noble the objectives of the administration are, technically speaking, it is de jure illegal for anyone to sleep outside, even if practically speaking, people are de facto allowed to do it, because as Chief Dekoff said, by necessity, everyone who's in enforcement uses discretion. That's all the question was. It's a very narrow question, not the broader one that we've been addressing tonight. All right.
Steve, can I?
Yes,
Councilman
please respond.
Can I add something? Maybe another way to look at it is when the council was meeting in person, there would be a police officer there. If you had someone that would cause a problem and would not cooperate with the wishes of the council on following the rules or whatever, technically, if you ruled them out of order and ordered us to remove them, they could be arrested for trespassing. I don't think there was ever a time we've ever done that. We would escort people out and they would just leave. So we've not had to do that.
That's a good answer. I appreciate that. Thank you. Further follow-up questions? If not, it's time to Mr. Smith. You're muted.
I promised I wouldn't ask another question, but I'm going to.
You did it anyway.
So I would like to ask if you, Mr. Volin, would offer a comparison of how this administration, how much efforts they have put into homelessness issues compared to previous administrations, since you have quite a longitudinal look at this issue and how administrations have functioned.
I am not a sponsor of this ordinance, and I think you're getting into the matter of debate. That's where we can talk about it after public comment. I think I have some opinions, but I think it's time to go to the public. With all due respect, Mr. Smith.
That's all right. Thank you.
All right. I would ask people to just hang on a second before they raise their hand. They raise their hands. I would like to ask members. It is now 8:41. Do we want to put a limit on how much time we devote to public comment? We have 3-minute limit per speaker. I think there's going to be many speakers. Does anyone have any thoughts or emotion?